Hello. Now I'm going to start off with some actual design tips, but have the designs I recommend at the end of the video. Now I'm going to start off with the basics of stats. So the two most important stats is definitely the attack and the production cost. Now there are other important stats as well, but it is an art of balancing how important each thing is. What I mean by this is I would gladly sacrifice 1% reliability for 1 soft attack. But if I had the same deal, but instead 20% reliability, I would probably not make that same choice. So it definitely comes down to how much you value each stat and in which situation you currently are. It takes a lot of intuition to know how much each stat is worth compared to other stats. For example, in multiplayer, you don't actually have to consider piercing versus armor because the current meta is tank destroyers, so you will always have enough piercing and never enough armor. However, for armor memes and space marines, armor is something you do have to consider. Another thing you might notice with a lot of these designs I show at the end is that the reliability is really low. That isn't because reliability is useless, it's just that reliability isn't as good as the other things we get in exchange for sacrificing the reliability. For example, in Africa, you do definitely want a high reliability, so don't completely throw it out the window. Also, with very low reliability, you do need to micro your tanks more, because if you battle plan them too much, they might end up fighting in marshes or mountains, and you might lose several thousands of your tanks just because you didn't watch them. Now let's start with the modules. The first one is the turret. Now this one is actually really easy to consider what you have to do. If we compare the breakthrough gained from going from a 2-man to a 3-man turret, which is an 8 breakthrough increase for only 0.5 production cost, comparing it to the breakthrough gained from the stabilizer module, which is 5 more breakthrough at 2 production cost. You'll see that a 3-man turret is really important and is especially worth it compared to modules such as stabilizer. So you definitely always want the best turret you can get. There are some few situations where you do, for example, want the cheapest turret, but in general, as long as you're making a very high quality tank, you just want the best 3-man turret you can get. There is also a certain situation where you can do the fixed superstructure, but I'm going to come back to that later on in the video. And this is more the exception than the rule. Next up is cannons. Now with light tank, it's actually pretty interesting. The reason is because you get the best cannon really early on, which is this one, and you don't get any upgrades at all. This is part of the reason why light tanks are so bad in vanilla Hoi 4. Because you don't have any upgrades to this one cannon, you are unable to scale into later game, and your tanks will just become worse and worse compared to the other types. For single player, you probably want the close support gun, because it gives a lot of soft attack. And in multiplayer, you're going to do the high velocity cannon. But again, you shouldn't really do light tanks in vanilla at all. So these are just considerations if you really do want to do light tanks. Also, do not do the automatic cannons or the small cannons, just because they have so much less stats. And an automatic cannon will probably just perform worse than having infantry instead. So please do use these if you are going to do light tanks. Now for the medium tank, it's a bit more interesting. This is because in the multiplayer, you're probably going to do the high velocity cannon, but in single player, you can consider doing the medium cannon. But in most situations, you're probably going to do the howitzer. If you're playing pure vanilla Hoi 4, howitzer is probably best in single player, but you could argue for the medium cannon if you're playing mods like Expert AI, where you do see a bit more tanks. Also the other modules, like the rocket launcher, and to a lesser degree the AA gun, these are just not worth it, because the rocket launcher just gives you less soft attack than the howitzer for really no upside at all. Also in general, the AA guns aren't really worth it, just because motorized AA gives more air attack. Now let's move on to the heavy cannons. Now this is also a bit more interesting, because in early game, there is a pretty common strat where people in multiplayer convert all of their heavy tanks to the heavy cannon too. But later on in the game, the advanced high velocity cannon is definitely the best. Of course, this is the last tech you will get, so you can definitely not do this one early game. This is the reason why heavy cannon 2 is more common. Also, I don't recommend anyone doing heavy tanks in single player, just because you get the heavy howitzer so incredibly late. and there is no other upside to having a heavy tank. Now let's move on to the special modules. So the first special module we're going to cover is the secondary turret. Now there are two types of secondary turrets. Both of these are actually really good because these are among few modules that actually give attack. Even though it costs a lot for a small amount of attack, this is attack you wouldn't get in any other way. So for single player, heavy machine guns are really strong, and in multiplayer, small cannons are also really strong. You only have 4 special module slots on your tank, so you have to use them carefully. So if you have 2 modules where one gives slightly more stats than the other, but also costs a bit more, you definitely want to do the one that gives more stats, just because you don't have space for any more modules. Of course, there are a lot of things to take into consideration, but again, production cost and attack is the most important. Another important stat is the breakthrough. So radio is also really strong just because it gives such a large amount of breakthrough. In the multiplayer, you're definitely going to see a lot of radio 3, just because you do need the breakthrough. But in single player, you're probably fine with the radio 2, or even in some situations, the radio 1 as well. Now the normal modules. So again, like the additional machine guns isn't that great, just because it gives less soft attack than the heavy machine gun. So I wouldn't recommend anyone using this. Amphibious drive is really interesting, and after Arms Against Tyranny, it's definitely better than it was before. It's still definitely something you have to be careful with, because it does cost a lot and have other downsides. Armor Skirt is great for armor memes, or if you do need breakthrough, but I would not recommend this on your normal tank, just because it doesn't give any attack, and it does take up a module slot. Autoloader also gives a decent amount of breakthrough, but you do get this pretty late game. So even if you're putting it in your breakthrough tank, you're probably not going to get it really early game, and it's maybe like good for D-Day. Now Dozer Blade. Dozer Blade is also really interesting because it is usually banned in multiplayer because you can meme it a lot. But in single player, it isn't really that great either because your tanks are probably going to move around more than they stand still. So it's definitely a fun module, but you do have to be careful with it. Easy maintenance is really good. The main problem with easy maintenance is that it does cost 30 experience. Otherwise, it is really good because even though it says minus 5% production cost, it's technically a bit more because you already have minus 20% from the riveted armor. I'm going to come back to this module later on. Next up is Fuel Drum. Now, I wouldn't really recommend this one. It is decent because you can put this on like your support tanks and get more fuel capacity. But in most situations, I would rather want breakthrough on my support tanks than more fuel capacity. And the extra fuel capacity isn't actually that large, so it doesn't always help me, and in general, it's just not that useful. Now, extra ammunition storage is interesting, because it does give breakthrough for no increase in production cost. So it's definitely good if you want a really cheap tank, but still need some breakthrough. Sloped armor is also good for like armor memes. But not something on your main tank because it increases your production cost. And in general, armor isn't as good as you think. I'm gonna come back to that when I talk about the different armor types. But in general, it's just not worth it on your normal tank. Smoke launchers have the issue that that doesn't give enough stats. Other things just give more stats for that same special module slot. So this one is just worse off. Squeeze bore adapter is also pretty useless. Just because you don't need the piercing in multiplayer, you definitely don't need it in single player, and it just takes up another slot. Now stabilizer is decent for those breakthrough tanks, but it does cost a lot, so do not put this on your main tank, just because it's not worth it. Wet ammunition storage is generally not worth it as well, just because you do rather want the attack and the breakthrough otherwise. But you can put this on if you do need something for more reliability when, for example, fighting in Africa. Again, it's one of those modules that you have to consider in very special situations, but in general, not really worth it. Now let's move on to suspension. Now this is pretty interesting because this is probably the most balanced part of the tank designer. So you can sort of do what you want here depending on your goals. Cruise suspension is pretty common just because you usually don't have that much speed and you do need speed in multiplayer. But interleaved is perfectly fine for those breakthrough tanks. And torsion bar also works fine if you're fighting in Africa, for example, and bogey is just cheap. Also, the special suspension for light tanks is also pretty decent for some certain situations where you do need them really cheap. Next up is armor. Now, in 90% of situations, you're going to do the riveted armor. This is because the minus 20% production cost is huge. Cast armor and welded armor is just not worth it, because the extra armor compared to the increase in production cost is just not worth it. If every pixel on your screen is literally made of military factories, you could maybe afford these two, but otherwise riveted is just more worth it. You will never see a player in multiplayer not doing riveted armor on their main tank. Welded armor is acceptable for your armor memes, but in no other situations. Next up is the engine. Now, in most situations, you're just going to stick with the gasoline, but there are some situations where diesel is acceptable when you do need the reliability, and even petrol electric. This is because it just gives more breakthrough. So this is decent for those breakthrough tanks, but you do have to be careful. Now, let's look at the different types of upgrades. Engine clicks is definitely good just because there isn't really any other way to get a lot more speed. So it is usually worth it to get the speed up to what your division does have. But so in multiplayer, you're probably just going to get it up to 17 because that is what you would usually research. But for some other different types of tanks, you just need enough engine upgrades to match the speed of your actual tank division. Armor clicks is also pretty interesting. This is because in most situations, you are not actually doing this for the armor, but rather the breakthrough. Again, armor isn't actually that good, so if you do need the breakthrough, this is definitely something worth looking into. Especially in multiplayer, where you are going to have a huge breakthrough penalty from doing tank destroyers, you are going to need every bit of breakthrough that you can get. For your armor memes, you can definitely click this to get more armor, but you should not do this on your normal tanks for the armor. It's just not worth it. Now, you might have noticed that I've picked the basic medium chassis here. This is because it isn't actually worth it to do any other chassis. If we look at the different types of chassis, you will notice that they don't have any increase in breakthrough or attack. This means that if you stick with the medium chassis throughout the entire game, you won't have the same production issues that you will if you switch throughout the game. Of course, there is an argument to be made if you are doing armor memes by going from the basic heavy chassis to the advanced one. Going from the basic chassis to the improved one isn't really worth it for armor because it's just a 5 increase, but to the advanced one it's definitely worth it. So you do have to compare these stats to consider what is actually worth it. Now, another important thing to note about tank research is that you do have to rush for the cannon that you need. For example, in multiplayer, you're going to rush for the improved heavy cannon for your heavy tanks, if that is your strat, and you're definitely going to rush for the improved high velocity cannon for your medium tanks or the advanced high velocity cannon for your heavy tanks. In single player, you're instead going to rush the medium howitzer. Now let's look at the different tank MIOs. So for Germany, you only really have one viable tank MIO, and that's the standardized production one. The reason this is really the only one that is worth it is because this gives so much more production bonuses than these others do. So for the standardized production, it's probably going to look something like this with your upgrades, where you're definitely going to rush the mass production one, and you're going to get this one as well. But for these two, you can definitely consider this yourself. In multiplayer, this one is probably slightly better, but in single player, this is definitely better. So this is a decision you have to take. For the policies, on Germany, you can maybe do cutting corners if you want, but it is a bit of a risk because you are decreasing your heart attack. If you're doing heavy tanks, the heavy gantry cranes is probably a good idea. Otherwise, you can probably do the vertical integration one for less resource cost, but it's up to you. On a lot of other countries, you do have a policy called assembly line optimizers, which I'll put on screen here, which is better than most of these that you get on Germany. So that one is definitely worth looking at. Now, it's not only this MIO that is good. There's also the one called Infantry Tanks Designer, which is definitely also pretty good. I'll put the different upgrades that you'll probably do on the screen here. And it also comes down to just look at the MIO, at the different upgrades, and look at what you get. You want more attack and you want less production cost. This is generally what you do want. This is also the reason why the fast tank designer is so incredibly bad, is because this upgrade right here increases the production cost, and you don't have any upgrades except for this one that increases the attack. So this is just a terrible MIO because it doesn't really give you anything good. Now let's finally look at the different designs that I've made. Now I've tried categorizing this with the naming scheme you'll see here, where it's multiplayer or single player and either the main tank or the secondary tank with the side symbol or the side name. Let's first look at the most simple medium tank that I recommend for single player. This is using the best howitzer and the best medium turret, as well as having 2 heavy machine guns, the easy maintenance for the less production cost, and the radio for more breakthrough. Also have the Christie suspension for an easy increase in speed, still riveted because you have to do riveted. So I did diesel to have more reliability and still had decent speed from the engine upgrades. Again, you can balance this stuff around how you want it to, but this is just my simple recommendation. Of course, you do want the MIO here, but I just included it so it was a better baseline. Again, you can see that the focus is high soft attack at a low production cost, which is what you want to achieve with all of your main tanks. Now let's look at the medium tank destroyer. This is probably the most common tank design you will see in multiplayer, because this has an incredibly high heart attack. This is the highest heart attack you can get on a medium tank. You get this by having the high velocity cannon 2 small cannons, and using the tank destroyer variant. The reason why we are doing tank destroyer is because you get so much more heart attack. If I switch this to a medium tank, you will see I lose out on 12 entire heart attack. Of course, doing tank destroyer does cost me a lot because it does reduce my breakthrough, which I have to make up for by having the radio 3 and having a lot of armor clicks for the extra breakthrough. Also, there are some variants of this that you can make. For example, I have seen people do diesel engine on this. I have also seen people do torsion bar or even bogey to make it even more cheaper. So it definitely depends on your situation, but this is something what it should look like. You will also notice that the heavy tank destroyer is pretty similar. This is because it again uses the high velocity cannon. This time the advanced one, which has more attack, also uses 3 small cannons because you can only fit 2 on the medium chassis and you can fit up to 4 on the heavy chassis. Of course, I'm still doing the advanced radio and the armor clicks to still have some breakthrough because this is still a tank destroyer. Otherwise, it looks pretty similar. Again, you will notice the incredibly low reliability, but if you micro properly, this should not be a problem. Now let's look at the medium amphibious tank I've made here. What you will notice here is that I have actually done a medium fixed superstructure on this. Now this is also a bit risky because this does decrease my breakthrough by a lot, but you do have a bit more breakthrough to go off of than the tank destroyer, because the amphibious variant only gives minus 15%. This is compared to the tank destroyer, which gives minus 40%. You also do need the extra attack that the high velocity cannon gives, so this is a worthwhile trade. Again, you have to do armor clicks to make up for that breakthrough. You still don't really have enough, but you will get more breakthrough from these other side tanks that I will come to shortly. Again, you can do sort of different variants, and if you want to do this for single player, you can definitely still do an amphibious drive, but you're probably gonna look something more like this tank design and instead replace this one with an amphibious drive. So I wouldn't necessarily use this one in single player. Now let's move on to the secondary tanks. Now the reason why I show these main tanks first is because these actually sort of follow the things that I've talked about earlier. With these secondary tanks, you don't actually need to worry that much about production cost, just because you're producing such a small amount of these that you'd rather want the extra breakthrough that you can squeeze out than the less amount of production cost. Now let's first take a look at the breakthrough light tank. Now this is basically what you would do in your airborne light armor company. So this has only 4 km/h speed. You will notice here that I do a lot of breakthrough stacking. I have the autoloader and the stabilizer, as well as the armor skirts for a lot of breakthrough, the interleaved road wheels and the petrol electric for even more breakthrough, and a ton of armor clicks for even more breakthrough. Of course, this does increase the cost a lot, so this doesn't always work. And for example, if you are going to use a breakthrough light tank for your tanks, it's going to look slightly different. This is because you're probably not going to have the autoloader or the stabilizer by the time you're going to produce these. So it's probably going to have something like the extra ammunition storage instead. And it's probably not going to use the petrol electric one either, because you do need the speed. So it's probably going to look something more like this. But it still has a really high amount of breakthrough. Again, that is the goal. You have to adapt the speed for the speed of your division. So do upgrade the engine as much as you actually do need. Now I quickly made the flame tank design right here. Again, you will see that it's the same strategy with maximizing the amount of breakthrough. And again, if you do want this for your tank division, you are going to have to adapt the speed. Maybe put on a gasoline instead. And you're probably not going to have autoloader and stabilizer the same situation as the light tank. So it's going to look slightly different for your actual tank division than with, for example, your Marines. But it's probably going to look something like this instead. Maybe even Christie as well. But again, the point is to stack as much breakthrough as possible. There is also a strategy with having the cheapest flame tank possible, which is going to look something like this. Which is just the very cheapest possible medium flame tank. You can maybe even have some extra ammunition storages as well for more breakthrough. But the goal here is just the terrain bonuses and not having any breakthrough like you will get with this one. Again, it depends on your goals, so you have to do these considerations yourself. It also does take a bit of intuition to learn what you should do when, but that's just a matter of experience. Now let's take a final look at the armor memes. Again, here is a situation where you do actually want armor. Do not use this as your actual main tank, just because this costs way too much to have as your normal tank. You can maybe even get away using a medium 3-man turret and using a medium cannon as well, if you do want it a bit cheaper. But in general, you just want the most amount of armor that you can get, and having some additional attack as well doesn't hurt. Also, again, you do want a heavy tank MIO on this one instead, just to stack as much armor as physically possible. Now let's take a look at the late armor meme. This also looks really similar, but again, it's the advanced chassis instead. You have maximized the armor clicks, and you're also going to do the advanced high velocity cannon just to get as much stats as possible. Again, this does cost a buttload, so do not use this as your main tank. This is just for the armor memes. Now the last point I want to make here is about the variants, because I have got a lot of comments, people asking what I think about the different tank variants. So let's take a basic look at these. The first one is the tank destroyer, and this is really good for heart attack, which is what you do use in multiplayer. Again, this does cost breakthrough, so you do have to be careful. SPGs, also known as self-propelled artillery, is just not worth it. Because what you will see that even though I have a lot of soft attack, and it's still not a lot of breakthrough lost, the problem with an SPG is that the battalion takes 3 combat width instead of 2. This means that even if you have 50% more soft attack, you're still gonna have equal amount of soft attack per width than normal tanks. So these are just not worth it. If this would have been 2 combat width instead of 3, this could have maybe been worth it. But just because it takes more space, these are less stat compact than normal tanks are. And therefore, they're just not worth it. The only real advantage that SPGs do have is that it does give more soft attack for the same amount of IC, but it's just not worth it. You do want tanks to have as much stats as possible, and SPGs does not give you that. Now let's take a look at anti-air. Now I mentioned this earlier, but in general, you don't want to have SPAAs, just because motorized AA is better. I could maybe see some situations where you do want the higher hardness, but in general, it's just not worth it. Also, for Space Marines, again, it is not really worth it, because yes, it is slightly cheaper, but if you are doing Space Marines, having the extra breakthrough is actually pretty nice. So I would recommend that you do keep normal tanks if you are doing Space Marines. Again, this is a pretty huge debate, so this is probably not enough to satisfy everyone, but it's just my opinion. Now next up is the amphibious tank. Now this one is definitely good, especially after Arms Against Tyranny, just because you can stack a lot of special forces attack. But it also comes with some downsides, because it does cost a lot more, and it does take special forces capacity. So it is not something you can always do, but it's definitely a fun strat that you can do, and definitely something that does work. Lastly is flame tanks. This isn't really a variant, but this is really, really good. I've talked about this in my support company video. Medium flame tanks are goated. They are super strong and definitely something you should have in all of your attack divisions. Please do leave questions or feedback in the comments. I do read every comment, even though I don't always remember to respond. If you do think I'm wrong, please do leave a comment. My goal is to create the most factually correct channel, so any and all feedback would really help. If I think you're wrong, I will argue with you until one of us is convinced. Now I'll see you in the next one.